So as we all know, the comic book industry is huge and has been going for absolutely decades. But as you might expect with all of these stories coming out each and every year, some of them are going to be lacking in quality, and by quality I mean taste, sense and general decency. So let's look at the times that the House of M became the House of yikes. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 most inappropriate Marvel comic storylines ever. Number 10. Shang-CHI'S racist backstory. In 2018, Marvel Studios took a huge, long overdue stride in black representation not only in the superhero genre, but in the film industry overall. 3 years later, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings did the same for the Asian community, though it had to rewrite a lot of lore and history in order to achieve this. You see, on the big screen, Shang-Chi's father was Wenwu, who was an incredibly compelling villain. In this, he was the dreaded leader of the Ten Rings and the holder of the artifacts for which his army was named, but in the source material, Shang-Chi's father was nothing like this. Instead of somebody who enjoyed development and real motivation, Shang-Chi's father was Fu Manchu, a character for whom Marvel acquired the license for that was essentially the embodiment of just about every negative Asian stereotype possible. Originally created as a generic villain with no other traits than the obviously stereotypical, Fu Manchu was no different when he came into the Marvel universe. He wished to conquer Western civilization for seemingly absolutely no reason, and the main reason that he was really seen as a villain was essentially because he was Asian. There was little more to him than that, and it's no surprise that Marvel Studios has moved away from that as far as possible. Number 9. Hank Pym's domestic abuse. Despite being so-called super, almost each and every hero in the Marvel universe has their flaws, character defects that make them way more relatable, but in some cases, well, they've gone too far, and this is certainly what happened with Hank Pym, and it first happened in 1981. When Hank took on a villainous version of his Yellow Jacket alter ego. When Janet confronted him about his plans, he struck her. Ever since this, he's been labelled as a domestic abuser, and that is something that will never truly go away. Even in Avengers Disassembled, which is a huge crossover event, Tony Stark viciously jabbed at Hank and asked him if he had a wife to beat. Why would you ever want to remind audiences that this is what one of your heroes did? Number 8. Moon Knight's homophobic slurs. Moon Knight has recently become one of the newest heroes to grace the screens of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The character's early days in the comics, however, were far more problematic, in particular thanks to the treatment of one character. Merkins was a valet for the rich playboy Stephen Grant, a far cry from the MCU version of the character, who was verbally abused by the so-called hero of the story. Back in the mid-70s, as part of a Marvel spotlight to see if Moon Knight could carry his own series, Merkins was introduced. He was one of the franchise's first characters to be written to be gay, and was unfortunately treated atrociously for it. And if that wasn't bad enough, it was Moon Knight himself that led the way. The character was ultimately spying on Stephen for a villain node as Conqueror Lord. However, while trying to get answers out of him, Grant used several homophobic slurs that are simply not okay. Looking back now, it's embarrassing that this was ever acceptable, and that Marvel ever actually depicted a hero as willing to say these things. Number 7. Spider-Woman number 1. In years and ages past, female characters within comic books were a far cry from what they are today. Enter the damsel in distress, ludicrously over-sexualized in skimpy and wildly impractical costumes, or both. Basically, women in comics were often not approached seriously or considered as real characters. Thankfully, Marvel has made huge strides in this department, but there are still moments throughout its history that are impossible to ignore, and one of the most infamous is a variant cover for Spider-Woman number 1 that painted the titular hero in an almost unbelievably inappropriate pose. The artist in question, Milo Manara, was well known for his erotic art, so it's hardly surprising that his cover was explicit to the point of receiving a flood of complaints. While this is an inappropriate cover rather than a story itself, it became much harder to take the character seriously, so much so that Marvel had to censor the artwork. But this was unfortunately too little, too late. Number 6. The Ultimate MAXIMOFFS. Though regular twins on Earth 616, or at least as regular as mutants can be in this universe, the ultimate versions of Wanda and Pietro grew far closer than brother and sister ever should. With Magneto's unashamed abuse of Quicksilver, he was driven into the arms of his sister as both a sibling and a lover. Now, this isn't Game of Thrones, and it should surely go without saying that incest should have no place in the pages of a Marvel comic book. Fortunately, Wanda was killed off before this abomination could go on for too long. However, unfortunately, this isn't the only example of family members getting way too close in Marvel's history, because number 5, incest between Hulks. Just because a comic book arc is popular, iconic, and critically acclaimed doesn't mean that there aren't aspects of it that should never have reached the page. One such book is Old Man Logan, the gritty take on Wolverine as he traveled across a dystopian, apocalyptic United States of America. Instead of the typical states, the land was split up into areas controlled by different villains of the Marvel Universe. Both Doom and Kingpin run a fair amount of land each, but the entire West Coast was known as Hulkland and was run by an entire gang of huge green rage monsters. Though there have been a plethora of different Hulks introduced across the pages of Marvel Comics, an entire family of them raises certain questions. Uncomfortable questions that gave even worse answers. You see, the Hulk gang were Bruce Banner's grandchildren, but this wasn't the only Hulk blood they had. The family that existed essentially to give Logan a reason to be desperate and leave home were a product of an incestual relationship between Banner and his cousin Jennifer Walters. They may have only played a small part in Old Man Logan, but it's still enough to make your stomach turn whenever you read it. Number 4. Ultimate Hulk's Female Company. The Ultimate Universe wasn't just home to a weird and disturbing version of the Maximoff twins, there was also a Bruce Banner that caused certain headaches, to say the least, for Nick Fury. After massacres in New York, Paris, Ireland, and India, Fury hired Wolverine to finally kill the Hulk. Banner killed 800 people in a fit of rage after Betty Ross dumped him for Freddie Prinze Jr. And even still, that's not the weirdest thing that the Ultimate Hulk did in this story. You see, Bruce had finally been tracked down to Tibet, and when Logan followed him there, he found that there was absolutely no women around. With no help from the locals, he traced the huge green rage monster to a cave within the mountains and saw him surrounded by almost 50 half-naked women. Though incredibly dangerous, Hulk is usually thought of as a hero, and even in this story where he was supposedly executed for the mistakes he made, there was no character development that really led to this. Hulk going into hiding is one thing, but essentially making slaves out of the entire female population of Tibet? Why? Why, Marvel, have you done this? Number 3. The sexual abuse of Carol Danvers. Now, there are some exceptionally powerful beings that populate the Marvel Universe. Characters whose powers, abilities, and general physiology allow for bizarre and unnatural things to happen. As for Carol Danvers, in spite of her strength, she was manipulated and abused like it was absolutely nothing. Similar to Wanda in WandaVision, Carol fell randomly pregnant and went through the entire gestation period within the space of several days. However, while Wanda willed herself pregnant in the MCU, this was actually forced upon Carol by another powerful being who had absolutely no right to control her body like this. When she gave birth, her baby boy grew into an adult within minutes and explained that he used Carol for her body to birth him into this world, bringing him out of another dimension known as Limbo. He forced her to fall in love with him, forced her to give birth to him, and then wiped her memories of the whole ordeal. In the simplest terms, Carol Danvers was essentially sexually abused by the son of Immortus who called himself Marcus, and no one, and I mean no one, batted an eyelid. It's tone-deaf, insensitive, and even for a story published over 40 years ago, is utterly disgusting. Number 2. Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy's children. Spider-Man: Sins Past is famous for being one of the most poorly received story arcs in recent memory, and it's not hard to see why. Who could have possibly thought that having Norman Osborn fall in love with Gwen Stacy, sexually abuse her as the Green Goblin, and then father 2 children with her being a good idea? Reportedly, this was not the initial idea from the writer of the arc at the time. You see, Gabriel and Sarah Stacy were originally supposed to be Gwen and Peter's children, but the powers that be thought that this would age Peter too much. Now that's an understandable point, but surely there is a better alternative than this. The story was so bad that it was ultimately retconned almost 20 years later, with the children being revealed to be clones created by Harry Osborn, and Mysterio has some form of mind games against Norman. Though the story may technically not be part of Marvel canon anymore, there is no erasing it from history or the memory of fans who had the misfortune of reading it. And number 1, Peter Parker's radioactive semen. Now, Marvel could have made the decision to have Peter Parker's entire body pulsing with radioactive energy. The touch of his hand could have caused serious damage to someone, for example. And if the writers were so set on such a dark story arc, that could have been fine, but this took things way too far. Spider-Man Reign, a mini-series released from late 2006 to early 2007, was based on Earth 70237 and was set 30 years into the future. Life was very different for Peter here, as he was retired from the double life of a superhero and had long since lost his wife Mary Jane. Though dead, MJ almost haunted Peter as a hallucination, which as far as some of the entries on this list go was relatively tame, right? But it was exactly how she died that was the most shocking part of this story. As the title of the entry suggests, she was the victim of Peter Parker's radioactive semen. Years of intercourse with Spider-Man had resulted in MJ having cancer, which ultimately killed her. Peter having lost MJ may have been important to the overall story, but there was absolutely no reason to make it this dark. And there we go, my friends. Those were the 10 most inappropriate Marvel comic storylines ever. I hope that you enjoyed that. Enjoy is probably the wrong word. Hope you got something out of this. And let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye.